Structured, verifiable and mathematical. So every law is very organised, has a lot of order. In fact, you'll see in the order principles how much order there is with regard to principles generally. But the permanence principles allow for order to exist, and they allow for verifiable mathematical formulae to be created to describe the law. And this is a very important thing if we wish to create devices or we wish to make progress. We need to know what the laws are so we can make calculations, mathematical calculations and assumptions, which we then place into the different creations that we might have. Does that make sense? So this is a very important part of law. They're measurable, quantifiable and observable. So you can get to a result through what you would call empirical evidence or evidence that you get through your own life, but you can also get through a result through some kind of measuring system. So every single thing is measurable. Now, of course, the more higher the creation, the more difficult it is to create a measuring device to measure it. Right? And of course that means that the very highest creation and the emotions that flow through the soul of the highest creation are going to be quite difficult to measure using material measuring devices. So obviously we need to create new types of devices to measure, but at the end of the day, everything is measurable and quantifiable, which is great if you want to discover things and experiment with things. So in the spirit world, there is a very large amount of people who were scientists on Earth, who continue to be scientists in the spirit world. They continue doing experiments. They make devices that measure things in the spirit world, just like they would here on Earth. But the devices obviously are made from different types of materials and so forth, based on their advanced education that they've received in the higher universities of life, I suppose you could call it. When it gets to the soul side of things, though, we stop generally creating devices to measure things because the soul is actually a measuring instrument in itself. And the way God created the human soul is that it can measure things quite easily. So this means then once you connect with that ability, you're able to personally measure things very, very accurately. And whether that be time, distance, space, anything you want to measure can be accurately measured just using your soul. And you could sort of liken it to a person who goes around on Earth here. Sometimes you see people who have, usually they've been a bit spirit overcloaked, but you sometimes see people who, they can tell you a distance of something down to a millimetre. Now the spirit who's telling them the distance doesn't measure it with a tape measure or something. So how do they measure that distance? They obviously have methods of measuring it that actually are very accurate, that allow for those kind of measurements to take place. So this is what abilities you'll develop over time. And when you connect to your soul, these abilities develop much more rapidly. So you can actually tell how long things are, not from, or how wide things are, or how high things are, or what is going on with specific things internally, without even having to open them up to check them out. So that'd be handy for a doctor operating on you, if you think about it, if he could change some things energetically rather than actually changing some things in the body itself. So you could say that medicine nowadays is still very rudimentary compared to what we could possibly do on Earth. And the reason why that is because medicine really has only been developed in the last few hundred years, the Western medicine. Of course, there are other medicines that have been developed for much longer, but there's still a lot of problems with both of them. One of them is heavily spirit influenced, the ones that have been developed longer, and the ones that have been developed now with scientific evidence is a very limited scientific evidence to develop the medicine. And so, unfortunately, it means that the medicine itself is quite limited. But those things can also all be corrected because of this principle, really. Everything is measurable, quantifiable. That makes everything safe and predictable.